So speaking a little bit on the story that people opt in to tell, and sometimes people have certain stories that they have tied into the major mechanics of the game. Ian, you had a shower thought that might tie in here if you want to go ahead.
Yeah. So lately, I've been thinking about the concept of min-maxing, which is a concept in D&D and other RPGs where you are minimizing. I've actually found a definition. It is minimizing desirable quality or undesirable qualities of a character so as to maximize the desirable qualities in order to achieve the most powerful character possible in an RPG, whatever RPG that is. And so it's interesting because in D&D, we try to promote a lot of variety in creating characters and telling stories in different ways, but also there is the mechanical part of it, which is combat usually, or skill checks at least. And for a lot of people, this, just the inherent fact that there are numbers to be manipulated implies that there is an optimal route. And that's kind of how Pathfinder came up, I'm pretty sure, in the end, that there's so many feats, but in the end, there's only a few feats you really should have. And with D&D, we try to avoid that because we want people to play some interesting characters and we want people to have unique roles. And there's a lot of pros and cons to min-maxing because a lot of people think that min-maxing stops you from playing D&D as it was like designed to be played, which is as a role-playing game, as a storytelling game. So I looked up a couple of hot takes on min-maxing and wrote down the pros and cons of it. Let's start with the cons, I think. One of the cons that a lot of people talk about is that min-maxing can actually break the game balance because of its specialization. Because you are maximizing certain qualities, you might shine really well in certain scenarios, but in other scenarios, you're just completely unequipped. So in games like Oblivion or other Elder Scrolls games, you have the option to min-max and focus on certain things. But if you're going into areas that these qualities are pretty much useless, for example, enchantment magic or something like that, the School of Magic, you're not going to be able to do anything in a combat with a bunch of Daedra hacking at you with your enchantment magic, because it's just kind of useless on people who aren't people. And another way is, for example, with the rogue. Rogue is technically always considered a specialist in D&D because they have sneak attack, they have expertises, and they have other things. But if you put that rogue in a scenario where it's not, for example, a scenario you can persuade your way out of, or there's no like locks to pick or something like that, then you are, up a creek there. You're dependent on your other party members to be able to pull you out of this. And so that's actually one thing that I brought up with this is one of the pros of min-maxing is that everyone is unique and everybody has a strength and a moment to shine. But then you also have to consider whether or not some party members are sharing roles. Some of them, because we always talk about primary roles and secondary roles. Some characters are going to have the same secondary role, even if their primary roles are different. Or they may have the primary role the same or the secondary role is different. So that means that if you've built a min-maxed character, you're going to be outshining the other person who is, supposed to fulfill that role as well. And that was one of the other cons in there. The third one is that it's supposed to discourage variety. I thought this was interesting because, like I said, specialization, you would think that all the players would have their own role and stuff. But what it means here is that there's supposed to be some sort of optimized character or something. Instead of choosing to play a wizard and then finding yourself being harried by melee combatants and stuff, there's obviously an optimal character for that, the tank, the barbarian, or something like that. So, and this is what drives people, this prospect of the imaginary in D&D, optimal character that can handle whatever situation or all the most challenging situations. The fact that that is supposed to exist drives people to come up with builds and theory craft and really think about, this is where you're going to be covering most of your bases. And if you're in a scenario that, isn't going to work out for you, you should probably just leave that scenario. So it's just kind of funny how this optimization discourages variety, even though specialization as a team might encourage variety. So it's a little paradoxical in a way. And last but not least is that one of the biggest cons of min-maxing, according to the D&D community, is that it's supposed to discourage roleplay. Min-maxing is supposedly a reward for a lot of players who are more interested in the mechanical outputs of their characters being optimized in combat, not really caring about the story, being killers, for example, as John has up before. And just they throw the story to the wayside because they're more interested in combat than anything else, or skill checks at least.
An initial thought in all of this is it's strange to think about the community and how players will like verbally punish other players for making choices that benefit them. It's a strange thing to say, like, oh, well, I wanna play a tiefling, and oh, they have a charisma bonus. Isn't that cool? How about I play a sorcerer? Because that'll help me out. Yay! And this also fits with my story, and I'll be a good spellcaster because I get a nice charisma bump. How dare you optimize? Like, why? It's a beneficial thing. Like, why do we have to get really mad about that? And it's not even necessarily that they're, min-maxing. It's, oh, look, these connect. Isn't that nice?
All right.
There's a lot there. And from the pros end, we've talked a lot before on how if you build a grappler, you want your grappler to be effective at grappling. It doesn't make the character uninteresting to be bad at grappling or to be mediocre at grappling by min-maxing, or let's say optimizing in this way toward being a good grappler. You are fulfilling the story, at least the mechanical side. You're backing up with mechanics in the game the story you want to tell. So it's fulfilled in the game state and in the social state and the exploration state. It's all synergistically good, because there's a through line to the story you want to tell, and you don't have this weird misalignment where I want to be a good grappler, but I chose to make myself a bad grappler, so it never matches and it's not satisfying to me. That's a strange thing to start to bring up.
So, let's start with the cons. The first one is that it breaks the game balance. Now remember, we are talking about min-maxing in D&D 5th edition specifically, all right? This is no comment on 4th edition, no comment on 3rd edition, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Mechton, any other tabletop RPG that you might. This is strictly 5th edition. 5th edition was designed for optimizing in mind. They built the mechanics specifically, and they built the player suggestions in the player's handbooks to bring it back to expectations, with the expectation that you won't purposefully sabotage your character from a statistical perspective, which is really what you're doing. If you're building a wizard and you have intelligence be your lowest stat, like, you're not fulfilling the mechanics that the game was expecting you to do. So this whole argument that it somehow breaks the game balance, I don't think it carries any weight, especially since the designers have acknowledged that they expect players to basically have their racial and class scores line up. And the other thing is, with 5th edition's design, they intentionally did not add a lot of small choices, because small choices lead to small gaps in power that over time create large gaps of power, which is the Pathfinder problem, right? That because there are so many feats and so many chances to gain additional feats every other level, like, because of that, the optimized or min-maxed feat chain is very specific to what's going to be the best outcome. 5th edition doesn't have that. You don't have these small choice points. You have very large, clear choice points, which means that, if you're a min-maxer, you still have a choice of undesirable statistic, right? As Ian put it. So, and the other thing is, usually a character only needs to prioritize 2, at most 3 ability scores, and then the other 3 you can it doesn't usually the other three kind of fall by the wayside. Now that being said, in 5th edition's main game system, the 3 ability scores that it tends to value the most are dexterity, constitution, and wisdom. Those are the 3 that you see as common saving throws. We talked about this before. Dexterity also influences your initiative and your armor class. Constitution is your hit points, right? So if you put a negative into your constitution, don't be surprised that you get knocked out easily. And then wisdom, perception is the most common skill check of the game, whether it's a passive perception or an active perception. So when you're designing, like, let's say like a paladin, it's clear your 3 ability scores you're going to prioritize are strength, con, and charisma, right? You're an upfront fighter. You want to actually hit stuff. Your spellcasting modifier is charisma. Those are your 3 things. Where you decide to put your other ability scores is going to flavor that character. So the thing that people who criticize min-maxing often forget is that they're so focused on tearing down the maximize part, they forget about the minimize part. And the other thing is, this isn't accounting for team dynamic, right? Which I think Ian also brought up, but you have a character that's a rogue. They've got awesome, let's say, dex and intelligence, but they don't have awesome strength. You have a barbarian that has strength and con. They kind of make up for each other's weaknesses. That's what the game is supposed to be. Speaking about expectations. The thing about discouraging variety comes back to this, right? So, you can, let's say, rogue is my favorite one to bring, because rogue really, the only stat you really need to be an effective rogue is dexterity, There's a rogue archetype for everything else. Like, there's a rogue archetype for dex and intelligence. That's arcane trickster. Swashbuckler is dex and charisma, Scout rogue or inquisitive is dex and wisdom, So if you just want to be like just a tough rogue, dex and con, there you go, So like, and those are all super different characters, I don't think that somehow, and really when it comes to min-maxing, we are specifically in 5th edition just talking about ability score distribution. That's it. Like, and to bring it back to randomness versus fixed, like, really, as soon as you let your players roll for their stats, you can't even talk about min-maxing, because you might have a player that has all high stats and a player that has all low. Has nothing to do with the choices they've made to allocate those stats. It has everything to do with the luck of the dice, right? The other choice point you have would be like skill proficiency distribution. Sometimes there are just some skills that are better than others. Really, Jeremy Crawford recently said, the amount of skills is what matters for a character's power, not what skills your character's proficient in. Yeah, having a high dex or a high perception or a high insight will probably help. But when it comes to everything else, that's super situational.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.